Afghan war, about 6 million women and children fled abroad while the men stayed behind to fight. The refugee kids would later be indoctrinated by Pakistani clerics and turned into the Taliban. A decade later, the Taliban youngsters would return home to fulfill their zealous goals for an Islamic state. So let's talk about the social evolution of the Taliban. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. If you like our content, hit the like button, turn on the notification bell or leave a comment. The Soviets had brought overwhelming military superiority to the field. Their tanks, jets, artillery made quick work of the anti-government forces called the Mujahideen. However, regardless of how many battles the Soviets won, they were losing the fight as a whole. The Mujahideen had no central command, no unified organization to speak of, and the decentralized nature meant that there was no way to negotiate a diplomatic solution. They never engaged in pitched battles, fighting only in areas where they had the tactical advantage. The guerrilla fighters could therefore strike at will and retreat into the mountains. Soviet tanks and armored vehicles could not pursue into the elevated areas because the passages were uncharted. Even Soviet jets were ineffective because the Mujahideen used the flight patterns of birds as an early warning system. Whenever a large group of birds took flight, the guerrilla fighters knew something was up and took shelter beforehand. The Soviets were fighting ghosts, and in most encounters, they found themselves outmaneuvered. In the early phase of the conflict, the Soviet army was mostly shooting at rocks and dirt. In this type of combat, nearly all of the Soviet weaponry was useless, all but one, the Mil-24 gunship. Its thick armor could withstand a barrage of small arms while it hovered over the air like an angel and took down enemy combatants with its large rotary cannon. However, once the Americans supplied the Mujahideen with Stinger surface-to-air missiles, it was game over. The economics was set. A Stinger cost less than $40,000 to produce, while the Mil-24 gunship had a price tag of $10 million. And soon enough, the Afghans were taking down 1 or 2 helicopters a day with these new weapons. My friend Griffin from the Armchair Historian made a video on that very subject.
Hi Shirvan, if you want to see how these weapons were later turned on the Americans, head over to my video on the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, which you can find on the Armchair Historian channel.
Thanks, Griffin. By 1985, the Soviet leadership understood that the war effort was unsustainable. Yet, as difficult it was to fight the Mujahideen with their new weapons, it was even harder to identify them since they looked like other Afghans from the countryside. And most of the Mujahideen troops were just farmers and peasants. Whenever they weren't fighting the Soviets, they were plowing their fields, arranging marriages, and going about their daily lives. Sensing their strategic dilemma, Soviet military thinkers came up with a radical new doctrine. Since the guerrilla fighters and the Afghans from the countryside were indistinguishable, both were to be treated as enemy combatants. A plan of mass exodus was devised by none other than Nobel Peace Prize winner Mikhail Gorbachev. In the preceding years, countless villages were bombed, industrial sites were shut down, livestock was gunned down from the air, landmines were scattered over farmlands, and so on. Many of these landmines are still there, making arable land a precious resource. In just the first year of this deadly new doctrine, over 1 million Afghans died. Perhaps the most cruelest tactic was the Soviet toy mine. It was specifically designed to attract children, but it was only strong enough to maim them. The science behind this was that injured families would not be capable of putting up further resistance. It was that kind of a war. The ultimate objective was to force the rural population into the urban areas, which the Soviets did control. Kabul's population nearly tripled, but most Afghans, more than 6 million, fled their homeland to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. Children made up a disproportionate bulk of the refugees. Remember these kids, because one day they will return. The refugees, however, were not whole families. Women, children, and elderly people left their homes while the men stayed behind to defend it. Whoever was of fighting age was given a rifle and pointed towards the direction of the foreign enemy. Now, Afghans were familiar with combat, but this level of genocidal warfare was nothing they had seen before. For Afghans, this was no longer a war against a foreign invasion, but a fight for survival. As families were torn apart, Afghanistan became a land absent of women and children. This was a significant turning point. As patriarchal as Afghan culture is, family ties tempered the macho behavior. Men were tough, but they would also intuitively display signs of pride, affection, generosity, and protection. Disconnected from their families for years, the Afghan fighters became emotionally disturbed. Most of the Mujahideen guerrilla fighters found themselves stuck in the sole company of other adult men in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. War can change men, and in Afghanistan, it changed millions. In Pakistan, in the city of Peshawar, ethnic Pashtuns organized fundraisers, collected weapons, and recruited volunteers to fight alongside their kin in Afghanistan. Soon enough, more than 80 factions emerged, all claiming to be fighting for a holy cause. The Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI for short, took hold of the situation. Prior to this, the ISI had been a relative small player in Pakistani politics, but with the massive resources coming in from the United States and Saudi Arabia to fund the Afghan war effort, the ISI quickly rose to the top of Pakistan's political food chain. The ISI distributed money, weapons, and volunteer fighters to its favorite Pakistani-based groups, which then sent these across the border into Afghanistan. Each of the Pakistani groups claimed the mantle of leadership, and each tried to prove their devotion to the Afghan cause by taking more radical Islamic narratives. As the war in Afghanistan dragged on, the Pakistani groups took on increasingly zealous attitudes, one more extreme than the other, until extremism was the new normal for the Afghan Mujahideen. By 1988, the Soviet war machine could bear no more and retreated. They abandoned their Afghan communist allies to the wolves. The government in Kabul desperately tried to reach a peace deal, but it was to no avail. Too much blood had been spilled, and without Soviet support, the Kabul government had no leverage for negotiations. There was still enough Soviet military hardware to hold out a fight, but in 1992, things eventually fell apart. The Mujahideen forces enclosed on Kabul and overthrew the communist leadership. However, once in Kabul, the Mujahideen groups came to blows with one another. They started occupying different parts of the city and fired thousands of rockets on each other. The carnage ripped Kabul apart. Half of the city was reduced to rubble. A similar fate took hold in the other cities, where competing Mujahideen forces turned their rifles against one another and fought to solidify their holdings. Essentially, what the Soviets did to the countryside, the Afghans did to their cities. And soon enough, chaos engulfed Afghanistan as many sovereign domains emerged all across the country, all of which erected checkpoints on what remained of the roads. Remember those kids we mentioned earlier who fled their homes due to the Soviet depopulation strategy? Well, the years had not been kind to them. Growing up in refugee camps is no childhood. Most of these kids had no father figures, and all they knew was poverty. A whole generation of Afghan kids grew up in these camps. There was only one way to escape: Pakistani madrasas. These were religious schools that provided free education. It gave the kids some sense of normality, routine, and something they could look forward to. The schools were run by clerics who answered to the Islamist parties in Pakistan and were closely connected to the ISI, while their funding mostly came from the wealthy Saudi families. More than 2,000 such madrasas operated in Pakistan by the Afghan border, and an estimated 220,000 children enrolled in these schools. Now, you can see where this is going. The refugee kids were virtually cut off from the world news and were indoctrinated into the Wahhabi faith. The students were made to believe that they were destined to rescue the world from evil, and evil constituted anything that was not familiar to them. Many of these madrasas also taught combat skills in addition to religion, so their students could go and fulfill the apocalyptic narrative. These students became the Taliban. The word Taliban is the plural word for student in Arabic. In the Afghan city of Kandahar, a Taliban cleric by the name of Mullah Omar had led a group of youngsters to take over some districts from other Mujahideen groups. For the locals, this was a welcome change. Many of the smaller Mujahideen groups had turned to extortion, harassment, and persecution. With the Taliban youngsters, however, rapists were hung, thieves lost limbs, and other criminals were dealt with accordingly. At the time, for many Afghans, the Taliban may have seemed like bringers of stability when compared to the old Mujahideen. The events in Kandahar caught the eye of the Pakistani security apparatus, and soon enough, the ISI provided the up-and-coming Taliban with arms, funding, and additional training. By 1994, the Taliban took out the Mujahideen checkpoints by the Afghan-Pakistani border, allowing for goods to reach the Afghan markets. Prices were lowered too, since there were no more tolls. Next, the Taliban completely took over Kandahar and came in possession of artillery, tanks, helicopters, radio equipment, and not to mention hundreds of truckloads of guns, ammunition, and money. Meanwhile, across the border, Pakistan opened the gates of the Afghan refugee camps, allowing the Taliban students to pour into Afghanistan. Initially, Afghans welcomed the Taliban because civilians lived under the fearful eye of the Mujahideen thugs. Afghans were desperate for a savior, and the Taliban fulfilled that role. Following Kandahar, the Taliban drove out the Mujahideen from cities such as Ghazni, Wardak, Logar, and others. By 1995, they took the city of Herat and were headed towards the capital Kabul. In late September 1996, residents of Kabul found their streets being patrolled by young men with black turbans. The Taliban looked as foreign as the Russians. They spoke a different dialect, were educated in a faraway land, and descended from the refugee families from the mid-1980s. As soon as the Taliban settled into the seat of power, reality sunk in. Women were henceforth forbidden to take part in the public life, thieves would lose limbs, music, films, and even photos were banned, theaters were turned into mosques, video stores were burnt down, and TV sets were smashed. Gambling was outlawed, pets were forbidden, the celebration of non-Islamic festivities was criminalized, and even traditional Afghan customs such as kite flying was prohibited. Every man and woman had to wear clothing according to the mandates of Sharia, beards became mandatory to men, and anyone caught not praying at designated times would be punished. Afghanistan became a totalitarian state. Much of the world turned a blind eye to the activities of the Taliban, mostly because the events in Eastern Europe took precedence. American policymakers knew little about the Taliban, and many believed that they would eventually evolve into a state much like Saudi Arabia. As far as the White House was concerned, it was business as usual. This sentiment quickly changed in 1998 when a French Arab-Afghan Mujahideen group called Al-Qaeda declared war against the United States. US lawmakers were caught off guard and asked their Pakistani counterparts to look into the situation. By this time, however, the Pakistanis had lost their influence over the Taliban. In fact, it turned out that the Taliban's promotion of Pashtun chauvinism endangered the territorial integrity of Pakistan itself. The political architects of the ISI had failed to anticipate this social evolution. Moreover, many of the lower-ranking ISI agents had worked for years with their Taliban partners and had grown personal sympathies. In practice, these ISI agents were as much as Pakistani patriots as they were members of the Taliban. The Pakistani leadership recognized that they had created a monster. The infection of Talibanism had already affected the lower ranks of the ISI, and the government in Islamabad refrained from taking any action against the Taliban for fear that the lower ISI agents would disobey the orders, possibly even committing a coup. This turn of events granted the Taliban a free hand, and Talibanism or Pashtun chauvinism overran the entirety of the Afghan-Pakistan border. The Taliban could now do whatever it pleased. The rival Mujahideen leaders were assassinated, the 6th century Buddha statues of Bamyan were destroyed, and Mullah Omar of the Taliban delivered a stark warning to the Prime Minister of Pakistan that he could either enforce Sharia or deal with the instability. Concerning the Taliban, all bets were off, and that would become even clearer following the attack on September 11, for Afghanistan would once again be in the spotlight.